Hello, I suppose we are online. My name is Tobias Scher, and I'm supposed to introduce Pavel Iosad. Are you here, Pavel? Hello,
Yep, I'm here.
Online. My name is Tobias Scher, and I'm supposed to introduce Pavel Iosad. Are you here, Pavel? Okay, so we have a little delay. And
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Okay, so we have a little delay. Okay, so have a little delay. Okay, so I hope things work fine now. So my name is Tobias Scher. I'm supposed to introduce Pavel Iosad as a phonologist. So let's start with Pavel's interest in language, which languages. So he's worked on Russian, and in Slavic more generally, and that is what his talk will be about today, empirically speaking. His PhD was on Celtic in 2012. And his theoretical interests, I think, are manifold, but I would like to single out two of them. One is the fact that Pavel is working in OT, in optimality theory, but he takes a particular view on that theory. So optimality theory was designed to be a theory of computation in general, most popular in phonology. And Pavel is taken representation seriously. There are a few optimality theory people who do that, and Pavel is one of them. He's actually preparing a book which is called Representations, which is the thing that optimality theory is not about. So it is an interesting crossing of a theory of computation with a particular view on representations that Pavel exposes, and of which we will hear something today. The second thing I would like to mention about Pavel's theoretical interests is the fact that he's one of the early people who have written about substance-free phonology. So substance-free phonology, the word was coined by Halle and Rees back in the late 90s. So substance-free phonology is the idea that phonology is blind to any phonetic substance. So labiality, there is no labiality in phonology. There is only labiality in your mouth. And in your mind and your brain, there is no labiality. So whatever you have in your phonology is abstract symbols, as Saussure said. It's an algebraic system of computations. And that view, substance-free phonology, there is a radical version of that and a non-radical version of that. So Pavel is among the radicalists. And he in his PhD, actually, he was developing that, and that view on phonology, I think, is growing these days. So that's what the picture I would like to draw of Pavel.
Thanks, Tobias. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for that lovely introduction, which is a very accurate picture of my interests and my career as part of the phonology so far. So sorry, I'm just going to share the screen very quickly for my slides. But Tobias said correctly, much of my early work is not on Slavic. It is on, for example, Celtic and things like that. But also, I am, I did do some work on Slavic, and obviously, Russian is my native language. So I want to talk a little bit about some of my more recent work that engages particularly the empirical material of Russian. And to an extent, as we shall see, Russian is, on the one hand, a pioneering language in terms of its importance that it's played in the history of phonology, and perhaps particularly generative phonology. But in many ways, it is, I will argue, both a blessing and a curse. And in particular, if we look at the development of how things have been in terms of what's happened to our view of the phonology of Russian, then it is now lagging behind in many ways, behind notably the phonology of Polish, which is another Slavic language, which originally was really in the wake of the breakthroughs in the phonology of Russian. But now I think the advances that have been made in the phonology of Polish in particular are quite telling and quite useful for us. So I want to sketch an approach to the phonology of Russian that takes into account some of the more recent developments, and I'm going to argue that we should probably reconsider many topics in the analysis of Russian that are still maybe to an extent considered settled in the literature, and I want to unsettle them and go through some of recent work that I have done that maybe shows us that. So how are we going to do this? I'm going to start by giving a very quick tour of the history of phonological approaches to Slavic and particularly to Russian. And I will claim that even though some of the advances and some of the developments in the analysis of Russian that were occurred in especially the early era of generative phonology are still, on the one hand, these approaches are they share a lot of the drawbacks of these early approaches that led to them being abandoned in very many ways. But on the other hand, some of the reaction to those has been quite extreme, viewed from the perspective of what happened in the 60s and 70s. And so I would like to say that I'd like to claim that there is much progress to be made in the phonology of Russian, and perhaps more broadly in the phonology of the Slavic languages, if we embrace a sort of an updated but not a radically different view of Russian phonology compared to what happened in this early pioneering era of generative phonology. And I have 3 case studies that I want to share. I hope I will have the time. I want to talk a little bit about the phonology of V, a very famous topic on which much ink has been spilled. I will talk about some of my more recent work on the mid-vowel alternation and how it fits into the picture of lexical phonology, or as it recently has been increasingly called straightal phonology. And if I have time, I want to talk about the big one, which is the vowel zero alternations in Russian, in Russian and Slavic, which are, Tobias, I'm sure will agree, are the lifeblood of Slavic phonology. So very quickly, Slavic, and particularly Russian and Polish, have been quite historically important because a lot of the pioneering breakthroughs in what we think of as mainstream Western phonological theory came out of Russia and Eastern Europe, or Central and Eastern Europe, and a lot of that theory engages Russian empirical materials. So we can start with the Kazan school, who Harry Holst, his chapter in the Handbook of the History of Linguistics called "Discovers the Phoneme," and both Baudouin and Kruszewski, who were both Poles but working in Russia, offered an approach to abstract phonological structure that we can recognize in very many ways as being a precursor of what we care about. Things like alternations, things like an abstract view of representations rather than just a focus on the physical sounds. This all comes from Kazan. Then, of course, there's the St. Petersburg or the Leningrad school, headed by Lev Shcherba, who really introduced, who was really the first person to introduce a definition of the phoneme that's quite recognizable to us today in how we think of it. And he was, of course, a Russianist, but for example, he also wrote his master's thesis, not his master's thesis, but his his early work before he did his master's thesis in the phoneme was on Sorbian. So again, a Slavicist making important contributions to phonological theory. Then we come to Prague and to Trubetzkoy, who, quote unquote, invented phonology. I mean, he really didn't, but again, is commonly seen as an important part of the theory of the history of phonological theory. And a less well-known fact is that he really a lot of his focus was not so much on creating a theory of phonology, but really on writing a historical phonology of Russian, because he was very dissatisfied with the sort of classical neo-grammarian approach exemplified by Scottish Shachmatov. And he never actually ended up writing this sort of phonology of Russian, but he always wanted to, and part of a lot of his work came out of that. Of course, we come to Jakobson, who actually did write the new historical phonology of Russian, and he wrote it, before a lot of the published stuff from the 30s that we think of as foundation for phonology. And of course, he did things like edited Trubetzkoy's Grundzüge, and is famous for his theory features, and also he, his seminal work on Russian conjugation from 1946 is really something that laid the groundwork for a lot of the stuff that was to come afterwards, and particularly the stuff that was to come from Maurice Halle, who didn't only help Jakobson with features and has this, the foundation myth of generative phonology is that Halle basically cancelled the phoneme based on data from Russian voicing assimilation. This isn't true, but that's what we tell our students. This is sort of the name and the importance again. But one thing that he really did, and that is really, really important, is his early work really relies on taking those derivation analysis and abstract analysis of Russian that Jakobson was coming up with in the 40s, and translated them into this new language that we can recognize as being essentially a version of modern day generative phonology. And of course, the sound pattern of Russian is not yet that really. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to complain about in my talk actually is not in sound pattern of Russian. It comes in later work from the 60s, and in particular in the work of Theodore Lightner, who was Halle's student at MIT and wrote his magnum opus, his thesis from 1965, Segmental Phonology of Modern Standard Russian, which really was, probably one of the first, if not the first, monographic analysis of a language that consistently uses the kind of highly abstract approach that we tend to associate with SPE. But SPE, of course, appeared 2 years later, not in 65. And in particular, it was in Halle's work in the 60s and in Lightner that we see a lot of the hallmarks of the analysis that we find in much later work on Slavic phonology, and particularly in Russian phonology. So things such as the underlying, a distinction between underlying or phonemic E and U, so the two non-round high vowels. In Russian, just like in Jakobson's early work on Russian phonology, there is only one. There's only E, there's no U. But we find this in Lightner among other places, and that is that stuff is rife. There's two underlying mid-front vowels in addition to the yer, which we'll talk about later. So again, the kind of underlier that is basically Proto-Slavic, and of course the underlying yers as being distinct from the other mid vowels. So all this stuff, it comes in and it gets its big expression in Lightner's thesis. And to an extent, so here are some, not quite random, but real examples from Lightner. where what kind of derivations are we dealing with? So for example, we have the first example here. We have the word kriki, which is the plural of shout, krik. And so what we see in the surface of presentation today is we have these two palatalized consonants, but derivationally they're not palatalized underlyingly, because there are no palatalized consonants underlyingly for Lightner at all. All the palatalization, which seems quite pervasive on the surface in modern Russian, it all comes from following vowels. So in this case, the first palatalized consonant re is palatalized because it precedes an e at the a front vowel underlyingly, and there's just this assimilation. But the second one, for reasons that we won't go into for reasons of time, there's a longer derivation because, according to Lightner, for reasons of morphophonology, the second vowel of this word is underlyingly actually an u, a back vowel. And then what happens is that first it fronts to an e after a velar, and then it fronts the velar to a k. And then we will have two sort of slightly more outrageous examples of derivations where we have extensive extensive abstractness, extensive absolute neutralization, and really a morphological structure that is that really has no clear correspondence on the surface. And so, for example, we have derivations like this. So here, where we have these long sequences of these year vowels that we'll hopefully get some time to talk about at the end. So we've got an alternation like mishok, mishka. So this is sac, genitive, nominative, genitive. So here we see that we have this alternating vowel. They all alternates with the zero, and where it comes from is from a year, from an underlying lax high vowel, and that vowel has to be front because it has to be able to palatalize the preceding ch to a sh. And so on this basis, we have a very long derivation where we have the year palatalizes the ch to a sh, and then it becomes a vowel. It doesn't delete, and then that vowel has to go to o. So there's a whole lot of things happening here, and it gets even more complicated if you have a sequence of years, which we'll not go into now, but we'll come back to it slightly later on. And so what I would say is that if you look at a lot of the fairly recent work on Russian, certainly a lot of recent work on Russian still, maybe it doesn't quite recapitulate this, but it revolves around very, very similar concerns. It's not the case for Polish. As I said at the start, there was a long tradition of work on Polish that followed in the wake of Lightner's works and Halle's work. Indeed, Lightner worked on Polish himself and proposed similar analysis for Polish. But and you do find this tradition also applied to the other Slavic languages, but fundamentally, in certainly the phonology of Polish, there has been a development, and Tobias's, I really recommend Tobias's review of Gusman's Phonology of Polish to anyone who wants to understand what was happening. It's really, really nice and succinct overview of what happened, and in particular, the two things that we can see as a theme developing in this work on a language like Polish is that there is a tendency to not have these really long and really complicated derivations. We're not really, applying a whole battery of rules that go from, these kinds of underliers to more concrete surface representations. That's really not what's happening. And, in the extreme, it ends up with work like Gusman's, which just say, which basically, at least rhetorically, disavows any computation at all, in this, at least in a way that would be recognizable to Lightner. And conversely, there is more emphasis on representation. So things like putting conceptualization back into the underlying presentation and recognizing that some patterns are maybe not phonological anymore. And this is the kind of thing that I'm interested in. This is the kind of thing where I want to know whether there are good representation arguments, how we represent the sounds of these segments, and what kinds of what the alternative patterns actually are is the kind of questions that really interests me. And also the division of labor on both on the phonetics phonology side of things and also on the morphology phonology side of things. So what I want to do is I want to explore whether there is a case for moving to this kind of framework also for Russian. So can we do better? Because obviously, I think you have guessed by now that I'm not too happy with this as the state of the art in the phonology of Russian. So in particular, so some notable developments that I want to engage with is obviously the development of lexical phonology, which as the foundation myth of lexical phonology is that it comes from Lev Bezetsky's manuscript from 1979, which is incidentally on Russian and indeed on the Russian verb. And we see appeals against Russian data in some of the earliest classical work on lexical phonology, and there has been also attempts to apply it in later times to Russian phonology. Then, of course, there's a massive amount of work that has gone into figuring out the vowel alternations in the years, and there's a whole tradition of work on this that, again, in very many respects, entirely disavows the I don't want to say mainstream, but the line of theoretical developments that goes from Halle and Lightner and kind of SP style, quote unquote, phonology. And anyone who works on Slavic should be engaging with that tradition. And then there have been sort of repeated episodes of particularly disavowing Lightner's claim that palatalization of consonants comes from following front vowels, that it's not there underlyingly, it is just derived from a following front vowel by rule. And there have been sort of repeated attempts to argue that palatalization is due not to the front vowels, or at least not exclusively to their being front vowels. And these attempts, have come from very different contexts, and they have been successful to various degrees. So I'm quoting here this dissertation by Farina, which Tobias, among other people, has critiqued quite fairly for not being quite the complete story that it claims to be. But nevertheless, there is a general idea that we should probably try to put some of the we need to think about a little bit more about how things are presented, rather than just trying to drive everything online from via a complicated system of rules. And so the claim is that we can make some progress and curb some of these excesses, if you want, of that tradition if we pay attention to things like representations, if we pay attention to the interfaces both on the phonetics phonology side and on the phonology morphology side in particular. I'm going to suggest that if we stick to a kind of fairly orthodox, moderate, straight-off phonology kind of approach, then we can make some significant progress in understanding the sound patterns of Russian and perhaps more broadly of the Slavic languages. So the first case study I have here is the phonology of V, the voiced labial fricative, quote unquote, which is quite famous because it has the sort of famous dual behavior, because on the one hand it behaves like an obstruent in that it does have apparently a voiceless counterpart, a f, and it undergoes things like final devoicing, and as in one, and it also undergoes voicing assimilation, so an underlying v can devoice before a voiceless obstruent, and in that respect it behaves like an obstruent. That's what Russian obstruents do. But in at least one important respect, it behaves like a sonorant because it does not trigger voicing assimilation of preceding obstruents, right? So you have a contrast between tv and dv in a way that you don't have a contrast between db and db. I'm struggling to say that, right? You can't have a T followed by a B in Russian at all, but you can definitely have a T followed by a V. Again, this is a long-standing kind of puzzle, which then also intersects with a set of claims that have been made in literature concerning sonorant transparency to voicing assimilation, right? So there's a claim that sonorants in Russian are transparent to voicing assimilation. So as you see in 4a, things like proclitics are subject to final devoicing. And in 4b, we see that, as expected, we don't have a voicing assimilation to a sonorant. It's not a thing in Russian. But the claim that goes back again to Jakobson and to other people is that if you have an initial cluster of a sonorant and obstruent, then that obstruent will be able to trigger assimilation across the obstruent. And so the claim is that you have this voicing transparency, this transparency, and that you also have it across a V. So the claim is that this is another respect in which a V behaves like a sonorant, as you can see in these examples here, right? So you see that in 5b and c, in 5c we see that v doesn't ordinarily trigger assimilation, so behave like a sonorant across the word boundary, and that in 5d you see that is also transparent. Again, this is sort of the claim. Now, on the other hand, whenever v is devoiced, wherever it comes out as f, it starts behaving like a normal obstruent and can trigger voicelessness assimilation for preceding segments as well. And so the account that we have in Kiparsky's 85 paper about lexical phonology, so he offers an account, and there's other people like Bruce Hayes who have also worked on this. The basic way in which this is usually analyzed is that underlyingly the v is something else. It has some kind of phonological property that actually sets it apart from sonorants, from obstruents. So underlyingly it is, so in the case of Kiparsky and Hayes, for example, is underlyingly a w. It is underlyingly a glide, which it is historically, of course. It does not have a voiced counterpart in the same voiceless counterpart in the same way that other sonorants don't have a voiceless counterpart. And so what happens is that you have voicing assimilation, which happens as a lexical rule, and it is able to target things that do have voiceless counterparts, like B's. And then there is sort of a second round of phonology, post-lexical phonology, which is, again, this is the 80s, so we care about things like structure preservation. So now it is not structure preserving, so it can do this thing where it devoices the w, the w to a w, which then itself can trigger assimilations and things like that. And then at the very end of the derivation, this voiceless w becomes an f. Right. So fundamentally, you can see that this is still, even though we're doing something more nuanced, we're doing lexical phonology here. And things like that. We're still, sticking to this basic idea of, the Lightner-Halle approach, which is that we have an underlying presentation that's essentially Proto-Slavic. Russian v is Proto-Slavic w. That's pretty much everyone agrees with that. And then we have this rule of strengthening that turns an actual w into a v. And there are lots of approaches that take some version of this take, which we won't go into for sort of in the interest of time. And so my proposal is that really we can resolve this conundrum without necessarily having this kind of derivation that recapitulates history, if we take representation seriously and we take interfaces seriously. Right? So in particular, the assumption that I am questioning in this particular case is that the devoicing of this segment v is a phonological rule that makes it voiceless. That it is there's a symbolic operation which takes something that has a specification phonologically as being voiced and turns it to something else that phonologically, symbolically has whatever you want to call the voiceless specification. So in fact, if you look, it is true that if you look more closely at the devoicing and voicing behavior of the Russian label fricative, then it does behave a lot like a sonorant, and indeed it devoices just like sonorants do. But in the case of sonorants, it is fairly uncontroversial that the devoicing of sonorants is not a phonological process. It's not a symbolic operation making something voiced phonologically into something voiceless phonologically. It is a phonetic process. People agree on that. And then the same, if we take that seriously, then the same should be true also of the V. So as I say, it is uncontroversially possible that sonorants can be voiceless in various kinds of contexts, as you can see here. So before a final devoiced obstruent and also word finally, in certain kinds of contexts. And again, people kind of recognize that, this isn't something that the phonology cares about. This isn't something that's part of phonological computation. But there's not the sort of step that the same can be true of v. But there is quite a bit of evidence that we can't go into again for lack of time. But there is, I believe, quite a bit of evidence that the devoicing of v is actually is actually steered by phonetic factors and is phonetically variable in much the same way as the devoicing of sonorants is phonetically variable, except that V is phonetically more prone to being pronounced like an obstruent, and therefore it is more obvious. You can see it better because there's more chance of it actually becoming voiceless. Particularly, there's a very famous sort of conundrum which concerns these word final clusters of a voiceless obstruent in the V, right? Where you have something like trezvy with a zv, and then when you put that into a word final position, then the V devoices. Everyone agrees with that, but it doesn't quite trigger categorical obligatory devoicing of a preceding voiced obstruent. And this is a known fact, but people again tend to treat this as if it's actually as if it's somehow special to V, but it's actually not. So in fact, it is not special to V. It is special to all kinds of clusters that that end in underlyingly in the voiced obstruent, but this only happens in morphologically derived contexts, right? So you have this situation here in 10a, where we have the word služba, which is service, and it's only the genitive plural that you get this zero ending on that noun, and in that particular case, it starts behaving just like those weird zv clusters. It does not happen when there's not this weird derived environment. And again, if you know anything about Slavic, you know that the genitive plural is weird, and especially in Russian, the genitive plural is weird across the board, and we will actually see that a bit later. And so the claim for this, which I won't go into in all the detail, but you can ask me later on by email or in the chat. But the basic claim is that this is something that is really special about these kinds of clusters, that actually they're not final in an important sense. This that zero is not just a zero. It's a bigger it's a bigger zero, as it were, than just the edge of the word. And so because these clusters are not final, they undergo some devoicing, but that's not phonological devoicing. That is phonetic devoicing. And so what we see here is that we have the v behaving just like the other obstruents for the purposes of being voiceless. And so what this shows us is that the devoicing of V is actually this devoicing of V that is quite similar to the devoicing of sonorants, and also obstruents can undergo that kind of devoicing, except they only do that in this particular special case morphologically rather than across the board. But this Courtenay case shows us that actually there's both phonetic devoicing and phonological devoicing in Russian. They're two separate things, and we can account for the behavior of V by assuming that it's just phonetic, just as it is in the case of sonorants. So the conclusion is that really there is no strong evidence for a phonological process of V becoming F in Russian. So it's true that Russian has a V. It is also true that Russian has a F, but there's not the strong evidence that V and F are actually just voiced and voiceless versions of the same thing. We can analyze this in any number of ways. Again, this is not a new idea necessarily. Henning Andersen has this in his paper from 1969, where he calls, where he says that V and F are not what he calls contrastive twins. They're not the same thing, except one is voiced and the other is voiceless. And so, for example, one way in which you could do this would be by, doing some version of a contrastive hierarchy approach, whereby, and this is something that has been recently applied to Russian by Alain Drescher and Daniel Curry-Hall, where you basically just don't treat V and F as being of the same branch of some other feature, and then if that's the case, then you don't expect them to be similar and to be these kinds of contrastive twins. So here, we can get rid of a phonology that reproduces Proto-Slavic to modern Russian by taking more. By being more careful about what's phonetic and what's phonological, and being more careful about phonological representations. That was my first case study. The second case study concerns another kind of well-known phenomenon that people haven't really worked on quite as much since Lightner, which is a bit unfortunate, I think, because it's an important phenomenon that tells us quite a bit about the structure of Russian, both phonologically, but also more broadly in the context of the morphology phonology interface. And it is this alternation between the two mid vowels e and o. So the basic problem is that in native vocabulary, the distribution of a is fairly restricted, right? You don't really have a following non-palatalized consonants, with the exception of sh and ts, which are historically palatalized. So that's not a big problem. And obviously, it's no big problem for Lightner, because for Lightner, all these things are derived anyway. So but the alternation is that, when you have an e, which, as I say, almost by definition follows a palatalized consonant, if you look at the right context, and what you find is that sometimes when there's a non-palatalized consonant, what we call a hard consonant, after this mid vowel, then it becomes an o, as in 11, sielski, siola. But in 12, you have you have the example of a morpheme white, where even though in 12a we have an e followed by a non-palatalized consonant, it does not become o, right? And this is morphological, right? So some morphemes are like village in 11, they alternate, and some are like white in 12, they don't alternate. There are also a few cases where we get these kinds of situations, right? So in 13a, we have an o between two palatalized consonants, which is a bit weird. And most importantly, you have some interaction with morphology, and you have overreplication of this shift, right? So we see that, for example, in 14a, this root for dark, we have an a between two palatalized consonants, and that's fine, that's regular. We expect that. But in 14b, we still have two palatalized consonants, but between them we now have a back vowel, and that's not expected. Similarly, in 15c, we have again another o between two palatalized consonants, even though in that root, as 15a shows, you can't have a front vowel there, so it's not a problem. And clearly, this has to do with morphology, right? So 15c clearly has to do, clearly has something to do with the fact that in 15b you have a regular back vowel, as you would expect. So what does Lightner do? Well, Lightner Lightner says, fine, we just do it the way we always do it. We reconstruct Proto-Slavic essentially in the underlying representation. So the non-alternating e is the different vowel, what he calls a tense e, and nothing happens to that. It just merges with e, with the lax e at a very late stage. But for the case of the lax e, it becomes o in this particular kind of context, and then you have cycles, right? So you have this, so if you have this alternation like mjod and mjodje, right? So in the first case, you have an underlying e, and that regularly gives you a back o, right? So first the e palatalizes the m, because we're still in Lightner world, and then you get that rule whereby e goes to o after a palatalized consonant, but before a non-palatalized one, right? And so what happens in a derived form is that you first do the same thing, but on the inner cycle, and once you've done that, then the palatalization happens. The palatalization is triggered by the front vowel that's only introduced in the second cycle, and so you have this kind of classic counter bleeding pattern. Now, the problem is that this seems to make sense, but there were lots of empirical problems with this, right? So in particular, there are cases like here in 16 and 17 where you have words that look sort of essentially the same in terms of their morphological structure, at least insofar as Lightner would conceive of the way we conceive of the cycle in the 60s, where you are sort of forced to postulate slightly different cyclic structures for these two words, because in the first one, the suffix nik, essentially, which is two suffixes for Lightner, has to be introduced at it has to be in the same cycle as the root for the alternation to fail. But in 17, there has to be a cyclic boundary there for the alternation to apply, as it does, and there doesn't seem to be any good reason at all for this to work, for this to be so. Lightner offers some defenses, but they really don't work just empirically. So, and for this reason, this kind of analysis was abandoned pretty swiftly, and in fact, Trubetzkoy and Kiparsky's criticism and the move to phonology was indeed largely one of its points was to move away from this kind of entirely ad hoc structure. And so no one kind of really thought about this since, certainly not in generative phonology. There's not been a lot of work on this alternation ever since this was kind of debunked. There has been some work, however, on this in other versions, including in Russia, in the work of Ilya Itkin in particular, who has done lots of work on this. And there's a very nice generalization that can be made if we sort of slightly move away from this, again, very historical analysis where it is about whether there is, a front vowel or a back vowel, sorry, a front consonant or a back consonant following, but whether it has to do with what kind of morpheme, what kind of suffix follows the alternation side, because all suffixes either have or don't have a palatalizing effect on the preceding consonant, and just there is a connection between what the vowel the suffix is and whether it triggers alternation, but it's not absolute. There are morphemes that trigger palatalization but don't start with a front vowel, for example. But fundamentally, the idea is that if there is a mid-vowel alternation, then the condition is that you have a front vowel on, in the alternation if the following suffix is a palatalizing one. And if if you have an alternation and the following suffix is a non-palatalizing one, then you get a back vowel. So obviously he still has to have the other underlying vowel, the yet. But nevertheless, this insight is great progress. It really shows us that we should be thinking of this alternation not necessarily in terms of its phonological context, the local phonological context, but really in terms of its interaction with the morphology. So here are some examples that you can see here, right? So so for example, in 22, right, we see that when you have a palatalizing suffix, the verbal theme e in 22a, that gives you a palatalized l, but also the vowel becomes front, right? Whereas if you have a non-palatalizing diminutive ok, then you have obviously a non-palatalized l, but also the vowel remains back. So that's the basic insight. And the important thing is that for Itkin, what he has to say is that some vowels are what he calls indifferent, right? So basically, the backness of the vowel in the derivative is just inherited from the base when you have these kind of suffixes, right? So for example, in 23b, we have the past tense suffix e, and it is a palatalizing suffix because it does trigger, it does make the preceding l palatalized, but it doesn't change the vowel in the root. That doesn't happen. And with that kind of approach, you can get a lot of mileage out of understanding how the AO alternation works. Indeed, this kind of thing is actually quite common across Slavic, although I make no claim as to how it actually works in those languages because I don't know. So basically, what we want to say, if we try to translate this analysis into some version of stratal phonology or lexical phonology, then basically what you have to say is that these kind of indifferent suffixes are word level suffixes, right? So they are joined for not for ad hoc phonological reasons, but they should be a principled morphological reason why those suffixes are word level, and there should be, right? So for example, this very famous example of this prepositional or locative suffix "e," the one that was on the previous example with the honey word, it is an inflectional suffix, right? So we expect it to be word level. It's the kind of thing that generally we expect to find in stratal phonology. So same thing with the past tense plural. We also get really productive diminutives doing the same thing, right? So as in 27, really productive diminutive is palatalizing but doesn't trigger, doesn't overwrite the backness of the preceding vowel. We observe very similar effects in languages like Spanish, where again you have really productive diminutives and they are word level, and you have these kinds of misapplication effects there as well. So there are some really nice examples where, in particular, what Itkin points out is that these productive diminutives, when they are productive diminutives, when they are the kind of suffixes that we expect to be word level, then they are indifferent. They're word level. There's semantic compositionality, and there is this misapplication effect. But there are non-diminutive versions of these morphemes that are not indifferent, that actually trigger both the palatalization of the consonant and the front vowel, right? So here we have, for example, this in 30b you have the suffix ik, and it is it can be a diminutive suffix, but in this case it's not. It's a fairly idiomatic reading here, right? So this is not any kind of Boyle thing. It's a very specific kind of Boyle thing that we're dealing with here, and it has both the consonant palatalization effect and the vowel effect. And this is the kind of thing that is really, really strongly predicted by approaches within straightal phonology, things like base-driven stratification that have been proposed on the basis of other data, for example, from English. So I want to go through sort of all the again, for reasons of time, really, I won't go through all the details, but fundamentally, there is a really strong case to be made, I think, for viewing this alternation as like it shows all the symptoms of a stem level alternation. And there are many, many theories of stem level alternations, and we can't go into them all. But take your favorite theory of this kind of cyclicity, this kind of phonology morphology interactions, and it should be able to predict the kinds of facts that we see in the AO alternation in Russian. And one of them is here on the slide, which has to do with this idea of stem allomorphy, which, if we agree with that, if we think that stem level phonological processes are actually not rewrite rules of this that some other later processes are, that they're more relations over sort of stored allomorphs, and things like parts of speech come into it, then we can have a nice theory of this, not only empirically, but also we can get rid of the extra, the non-alternating mid vowel, right? Because essentially, if it's all about, does this stem have a front allomorph or a back allomorph or both, and then there's some kind of selection process going on, and we don't need to have any of these abstract vowels underlyingly at all. So very, very quickly then, I won't have time to go through all the data on years, but I want to point out something that I think is quite intriguing and that I think is worth thinking about more. So as we briefly saw, there is a set of vowel zero alternations, right? So and in Russian, the traditional picture is that there are two alternating vowels, right? So here we have examples with o, right? And they are lexically specific. So some morphemes undergo them, as in son sna, but others don't, as in dom doma. They're not kind of trivially driven by cluster phonotactics, right? Because you can have things that are homonymous when the ear drops, but then it vocalizes in one of the morphemes but not in the other. And so the basic generalization, the lower generalization, is that if you have a sequence of years, then all of them vocalize except the final one, right? And you see that here. So the years seem to have some kind of palatalizing effect on preceding consonants, which is precisely why Lightner had two of them underlyingly, right? Because both of them alternate, but one of them palatalizes things and the other one doesn't. I commend again to your attention Tobias's overview paper in the Black Book Companion to Phonology, which really lays this all out very, very nicely. Is it deletion or is it insertion? Insertion is really difficult to motivate, right? Because you have these homonymous things. So that's why. So Lightner has this analysis with the lower rule, where you have underlying years that do their work in terms of palatalization or whatever else they have to do, and then they delete by the lower rule. This sort of has been recast in representational terms with these kinds of defective representations, so that these vowels are floating, or they're non-moraic, or you can sort of go the full CV. There's lots of work on that, which has sort of in some recent work in particular on Russian, not so much on Polish, although but really on Russian, there's been this kind of idea that we should sort of semi-resurrect, if you want, insertion. The idea is that, of course, there is the lexical element to it, so we need to know which morphemes show the alternation and which ones don't. But then the basic idea is that it is insertion, maybe driven by some version of cluster phonotactics, right? So, and again, I know that Tobias really disagrees with that, and there are really, really good reasons to disagree with that. So what I want to sort of, I want to slightly question and slightly revisit one aspect of this, and then I'll stop. The basic sort of, the basic claim about Russian is that there are 2 years in Russian, right? So Russian and Slovak are famously 2 languages where you have 2 of them, because you have, vowels that alternate with 0, and they have slightly different, they have different qualities, right? So we have den, dня, and son, sna. So we have an alternating e and an alternating o, and if you wanted to argue for some kind of insertion, whether like a full-on, phonological insertion analysis, or something more sophisticated with a lexical element to the insertion, as in the work of Guskova, for example, Guskova and Becker in particular, you need to know which vowel to insert, and that seems difficult, right? And like the funny thing about this is that this is absolutely not what a lot of the kind of more traditional literature says. So if you go back to the sound pattern of Russian, then it is extremely clear that Halle doesn't need to underline years, right? Halle doesn't, Halle just says you have this hash mark, and then you just put in, an appropriate vowel. And the reference here is to Distinction by Klakstad, which unfortunately I haven't been able to find yet, because apparently it only physically exists in the Harvard University Library, which I can't get to for obvious reasons. But no, in this subtitle Russian, there is only 1 year. If you look at the sort of fundamental work on Russian morphophonology, Zalesnyak's Russian nominal inflection, you don't have to, he basically says there is a star, an asterisk, and you can derive the quality of the vowel from the asterisk, right? And then also there's this station by Farina, which makes a similar claim that, you don't actually need 2 underlying years, you can only get 1, and you figure out the features from the context. Now, again, this is problematic because none of this actually has a theory of what the theory of the what the theory of the quality is, right? So, and why is that? Well, that is indeed because there are cases like babor, babra, where you have an alternating vowel and it follows a palatalized consonant, right? And we have examples like den, dня, where we have an e following a palatalized consonant, right? So the only way, in principle, in which you could try to predict the quality of the year is by looking at the consonant to its left, see whether it's palatalized or not, and then if it is, you insert the front vowel, and if it's not, you insert the back vowel. If that was, and that's essentially Farina's proposal, and it's not so simple, right? It's clearly the case that there are cases like babra, babor, where it's not the case, right? You have an o after a palatalized consonant. How does that speak to the issue of the 2 years? Well, really, after Lightner, the basic idea is that, remember, there are no palatalized consonants underlyingly, right? So in the Lightner tradition, you can't even express, even if you wanted to express that generalization, you can't, right? Because there are no underlying palatalized consonants. The only reason the consonant in den is palatalized in the first place is because it's followed by a front year. Like there's no other way for that to actually work, right? So clearly, how do we, if we still try to predict the quality of the year, how do we go about doing this? Well, we'd have to junk the assumption that palatalization comes from a following front vowel. So we expect to see sort of a pattern, a year is O after something that's underlyingly not palatalized, and it's A after something that's underlyingly palatalized, right? That's the only way to do it, which to me, it sounds like it should be kind of up my alley, because this really requires us to put the pronunciation back into the underlying representation. But what do we do about these cases? What do we do about Babot versus Babra? But we were just talking about this, right? We were just talking about the alternation between A and O, and how that actually turned out to be predictable as long as we kept ourselves to the stem level, right? So before we start, before we sort of even think about going to the word level where the A alternation always starts breaking down, at least if we're at the stem level, then actually the quality is predictable, right? So the basic generalization is that if you have a preceding non-palatalized consonant, then you always get a back here. That's fine. If you have a preceding palatalized consonant, then you get a back one if you have a back context for the purpose of the AO alternation, and you get a frontier if you have a fronting suffix of an appropriate class. And in this way, the quality of the year now becomes predictable, right? So this is now the basic generalization. So I'm very conscious of time, so I don't really have much more to say. I mean, I have some ideas, and I'm happy to discuss them in the question period. But I do think that this is an interesting claim, right? So it is a claim that is empirically quite strong, right? So if you go to Zalizniak's Russian nominal inflection, then his asterisk rules, which are essentially this, in a very different language, the number of exceptions to the asterisk vocalization rules is tiny, right? So you have 5 alternations that are sort of E and 0, of which 3 are clearly a sort of a special subset of the lexicon. So you're left with like 2 exceptions. There's one where an R alternates with 0. There's also one that's not in Zalizniak, but that has been found since, which has an U. And you're left with literally 5 exceptions, right? And they're all of the same kind. You've got these kind of non-logic pairs. So this is a tiny, tiny, tiny number of exceptions. The quality of yours, at least at the stem level, is really, really predictable. And so I'm going to skip the remainder of my slides, which are quite speculative, but I'm happy to talk about further consequences of this if you want. And I will send my slides and my handouts so they can be probably uploaded to next to the video if you want to see them. But fundamentally, there are some patterns in the vocalization of years in Russian that work extremely well if you assume some kind of stem level pattern of vocalization and then over-application due to kind of classic patterns of morphological over-application. So cases like this, which I believe don't exist in Polish, but exist in Russian, right? So in Russian, these cases like pios psa, and then the diminutive of pios is piosik, not psik. In Polish, those are regular ecdiminutives, I think. They're not these kinds of diminutives, I believe. So certainly you have these patterns where you have in C, right, you have a vocalized year in C before a vowel that shouldn't be happening. And indeed, this happen in inflection, but it does happen with, again, this productive ik diminutive that we just saw being, doing exactly the same thing to the AO alternation. And there's a bunch of other things that I'm just going to skip, again, in the interests of time. So to summarize, the years, the quality of years is only unpredictable if we're still in the Lightner word of no underlying palatalization. And then once we take into account the independently required facts of the mid-vowel alternation, then we can probably predict the quality of the years very, very well. And is there a case for the year quality pattern to be stem level? Maybe there is. So to conclude, very briefly, I do think that there is a case to really reconsider the Halle Lightner approach to Russian phonology, which is still knocking about in much recent work, just as the Poles have done. And in particular, I think that there is a lot of scope and a lot of insight to be gained if we approach this from a perspective that pays really close attention to interfaces, and as long as we get the representations right, which requires a lot of careful attention to phonology, morphology interface, to phonology phonetics interfaces, and also if we get the interaction with morphology right, which maybe, could be done potentially in a straight-hole approach. Obviously, if anyone's looking for a topic, then other than the Russian and the Polish, there are lots and lots of Slavic languages where very little of this work has been done, and that are really kind of open to a reconsideration along those lines. And I will stop here. And thank you.
So I think I'm supposed to drive the discussion, but I'm actually not sure how this works technically. I see on my Zoom, I see just Pavel and Mikołaj. And I know there's a live stream on YouTube. There are 11 people following that for the time being, I think. And now I can see myself. So how do people ask questions? Do they ask questions on chat or something? I don't know.
Yes, there's a question in the Zoom chat, and I'll be opening up the YouTube channel. But I think actually Tobias, you are probably much better placed to answer the question that Miguel has, which is what would be a good reading on Polish besides Guzman? And I'm really going to defer to you, Tobias, on this, because I think you know this stuff much better than I do.
On Polish, well, there's there's Rubach's work. There are two big Polish phonologists in the past 30 years or so. It's Guzman, who's dead now, and Jerzy Rubach. And there is Jola Shcherba as well, who's written on Polish. And there is Gienek Ceran, but he is a younger from the younger generation. And so these four names I would Laskowski maybe, but that's older work. Yeah. But overview is difficult. Guzman's book is a good overview. There's the 2007 book. There are the 80s books there's a Rubach and a Guzman book on Polish, specifically in the lexical phonology framework in the early 80s. 1980 for Guzman, 1984 for Rubach. And so they also give a good overview of what Polish phonology looked like then. But so Guzman has written this overview book in like 13 years ago now. And but Rubach has continued working on also on other Slavic languages, but hasn't done an overview of Polish.
Yeah, but I think it's I believe it's fair to say that sort of the early 80s Guzman and Rubach pretty much up to today are very much, in terms of the questions I've been addressing, they are very much within the Lightner tradition. So they have the underlying E and A, and they have underlying, and yeah.
Oh, sure.
And
in the 80s.
Two underlying years, even in Polish. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So one thing about Polish, one interesting thing about...
So go on.
One interesting thing about the recent, like 20 or 30 years is when we got into optimality theory, is that there is basically no OT analysis of our zero alternations. It's very, I mean, there is yearly in 95 on Russian, and then there is a more recent one of Guzman, of Rubach in NLT, but very little on any Slavic language on vowel zero alternations from optimality theory.
And I mean, I guess it's not really surprising, right? Because they are. I mean, for one thing, they're so morphologically, just bound up with the morphology in ways that when you don't have things like CVCV, right? When you can't really have this kind of articulated, phonological architecture, then it's going to be really difficult to do this kind of stuff in a very surface-oriented framework. It's really surprising because it's the kind of thing that it's quite difficult to do in OT, especially parallel OT, obviously, right? So, I mean, there's also work by, oh, I'm sorry, I should have it now, but it is in Polish. Oh, I'm really sorry. So the person from Amherst who's done this, you know, where the sort of the years, not having a year is, you know, violates some kind of contiguity faithfulness, and that's how you get these kinds of things. Oh God.
You know, you mean Guskova?
Yeah, but, no. She's Polish or Polish American, I don't know. But I mean, yeah, I mean, sort of the basically what is very difficult to do in parallel T is your chains, right? You know, you can do maybe one, like you can do whether there is a year or not, and you know, you can try and do that. But once you know, once you start to change, then it's really difficult to do it, especially in parallel T.
Well, Guskova's work actually is a fix of yearly 95, because yearly left open the question how you vocalize the years and how you get the right year. And Guskova basically, I mean, like 20 years later or 15 years later is a fix of that. But then you need to buy into what you exposed about Guskova's approach to the thing.
Yeah, but I was really interested. I was really surprised to sort of find that no one's really done the mid-vowel alternation, and like, you know, and sort of.
Well, how much work on Russian phonology do you know, or in years or whatever? I mean, there is Guskova, there is Paget, but not on vowel zero alternation as far as I can see.
No.
And then there's a whole lot of Russian literature in Russian that is hard to access if you don't read Russian. But even if you do, it's hard to find. It's, I don't know, you know all about it, but there's not much. Russian has always been a stepchild of vowel zero alternations in Slavic languages. I mean, after Lightner.
Yes. Yeah. Because. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of worth mentioning for context is that, you know, so one big thing that, you know, Lightner's kind of legacy to this was that, you know, in Polish, you only have one surface vowel that alternates, but it does get the same kind of, one of them palatalizes, you know, one of them is associated with the preceding palatalized consonant, and the other one not. And so, you know, there's a difference in this, you know, the Lightner's analysis was basically the same with two underlying years, except they merged into one e, rather than going, you know, one to a and one to o as in Russian, right? So that, you know, that kind of stuff came out of presumably his work on Russian, and that was the legacy. And then it's kind of, there's a more obvious problem with this in Polish, which is the vowel is the same in both cases on the surface, and that is maybe why we were able to, you know, there was a movement away from that. But in Russian, you know, we're kind of stuck with 2 years.
But you're completely right that the AO alternation is key for the phonology of Russian, because whatever you need to make up your mind about this one, and that will condition a whole lot of other phenomena. I mean, you have just demonstrated that if you get the alternation, if you take if you don't say the AO alternation is lexical, then you can get 1 year and not 2. So you buy a single underlying year with some allomorphy on the AO alternation, right? And what I have just been, I've been wandering into Russian vowel zero alternations just once, and I hit that problem of the AO alternation. I don't remember really, but I didn't really know what to do with it, but I understood that whatever take you have on this one will condition a number of other things.
Yeah, I mean, it conditions the whole. I mean, the weird thing about it is, you know, like you had this criticism of Farina, which was, you know, which was right, you know, because basically, you know, she didn't really address that. And, you know, and there's also sort of, you know, the other thing that's a lot of literature, I think, kind of doesn't really understand, which is easy to miss if you're coming from a Lightner perspective, is that the A alternation is actually quite difficult to do because you only see it under stress, right? Because in Russian you have vowel reduction, and specifically and like the crucial bit is after a palatalized consonant. You know, that's where you get the distinction between A and O, and of course in all varieties of, you know, any variety of standard Russian, A and O don't contrast after a palatalized consonant. They reduce to A or to E, right? And so, you know, for example, in Farina, a lot of the examples are of unstressed, like orthographically they're A and O, but, you know, a lot, for example, actually unstressed vowels, right?
Yeah, how will you know? You never know what vowel that is.
Exactly. So the number of examples is actually not that great, which is fun. For that, there was also an attempt by a number of people, both in the West by Hamilton and in Russia by Polivanova, where they tried to make the alternation a fronting alternation. So it was an O to A alternation, and that would buy you quite a few things. But that doesn't work either, sadly. Yeah, but fundamentally, I think to an extent, it is about the A alteration and kind of its straight affiliation. But really, the key that I think, you know, I think the key is really the underlying status of palatalization, right? So if you're not sort of dead set on deriving this from a following front vowel, which then forces you to postulate front vowels all over the place where there aren't any. Like once you accept that, then, you know, there's a whole lot of things that flows from this. I didn't talk about this, you know, but there is, you know, a whole other set of problems around this that have to do with, you know, palatalizing suffixes and the EU distinction, right? Where again, you know, Lightner has this whole thing where, you know, U is a front vowel, except when it does palatalize certain things, and therefore it has to become front at some point, and now you end up with, you know, a really, really long derivation. You know, and Halle sort of, you know, till, you know, some of his sort of last papers, you know, he still talks about that kind of thing as, you know, an important empirical result of generative phonology. You know, he thinks that this is actually good. This is actually the kind of thing that shows that everything works, which I disagree with, to be honest. But, you know, but again, it just comes from this idea that, you know, you can't have a palatalized consonant unless you manage to get a front vowel in there somewhere. Either it's a year or it's some kind of something derived, but it has to be a front vowel. And then it just really blows up your derivations because everything is just really going very, very abstract. And so once you stop doing that, then a whole load of things open up, including the A alternation.
One thing about the L-O alternation is that's specific to Russian or to Eastern Slavic, I suppose. You don't get that anywhere else. In Slavic, I mean.
Well, the A, yeah, not in that shape. Like you get some A alternations, but
oh yeah, sure.
not the same.
Yeah, sure. You get ablaut is it comes out as AO in many Slavic languages, but I mean in the European ablaut. But these synchronic alternations is just Russian. I've never seen that in another Slavic language.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to know a bit more about that, because I mean, obviously, you don't get this precise thing, but you get a lot. But you do get cases like, so there was one I had from Bulgarian where you don't have a or, right? So the old a doesn't go to o, but what you have is the old yat going to a, right? And so again, you have non-alternating a and an alternating a. So that kind of thing happens. And in Polish, you have the same thing with the a and a, right? So there's those kinds of things kind of happen, but I don't know enough about them to have like a considered opinion. But I think it would be interesting, because my sense is we would probably, I would expect something like this to happen. I would actually be quite surprised if we didn't get straight effects like this in at least some of the other Slavic languages, because it's the kind of thing that is, like, intuitively it seems like it's ripe for being pacified, right? Because it historically has to do with whether the following thing is palatalized or not, right? But then you've got, once your years have gone away and you get consonant clusters, and they start assimilating and palatalization in all kinds of weird ways, and then, you know, and that sort of create, even in Russian, you have these, like the AO, like one of the, you know, there are kind of important cases to support this kind of morphology-centered view of the alternation, because you often see that, this suffix is palatalizing and it does the fronting of the vowel, but you can't really see it as a local effect of, as local effect of palatalization on the consonant, right? So if you have an example like sister, right, which is, so it's, siostre, but siestrinsky, right? So like the cluster behaves as if it was palatalized. You get, well, the cluster doesn't. Like what you get is, you get the alternation in the root, which is due to the suffix being palatalizing, but the actual consonant next to it is not. It is that doesn't exist. Actually, that contrast is neutralized. So you have to have a story for that. And that kind of opacity, that kind of sort of weird effect, I would be surprised if it didn't lead to, with my straight-lit phonology / life cycle hat on, I mean, I'm really surprised if it didn't lead to exactly this kind of thing where that alternation that historically was conditioned by just the palatalization of the consonant, if it doesn't become something stem level because of all of this sort of stuff being really, really pacified to the right of it. But I don't know. I don't. So again, someone should look into Bulgarian or something. Right. So I don't think there are any questions in YouTube either. So I don't know. All right, I suppose we're done. Thank you. So I will email my sort of I have a handout rather than slides, so I will just email that, and I guess it can be posted in the comments on YouTube, or I will do that myself. I can do that. That's fine. And if anyone is wants to find out more, then my email is very easy to find on the internet. And thank you to BS especially for doing this at short notice.